What if I told you that 1,500 years before Columbus, the Romans may have already visited America? Rumors of mysterious ruins and coins bearing the profiles of Caesars have been stirring the imagination for decades. But the truth turned out to be even more incredible. While we were searching for ghosts of Rome in American forests, we overlooked real megacities, pyramids taller than those in Egypt, and civilizations whose greatness we are only beginning to realize. Who really built ancient America? Get ready. We're going back in time to separate myth from reality and uncover the secret of the true masters of the continent. Thank you for joining us on this journey and rediscovering the ancient history of America. If you found this interesting, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next investigations. And let's discuss in the comments. What do you think was the main reason for the rapid decline of Cahokia? Environmental disaster, civil war, or something else? We look forward to hearing your theories. Imagine the world as it was seen by the first European colonists. The endless, untouched forests of North America, stretching, it seemed, from one end of the earth to the other. A continent inhabited, as was then believed, exclusively by nomadic tribes who knew nothing of monumental architecture or durable stone structures. The official history that each of us studied in school states that Christopher Columbus reached the shores of the New World in 1492. But what if this coherent picture is incomplete? What if, long before him, perhaps 1,500 years before his caravels dropped anchor at unknown islands, representatives of a completely different civilization had already been here? People from a world that, as is commonly believed, had no connection to this continent. This is a quiet but persistent whisper that has been stirring the minds of enthusiastic researchers, amateur archaeologists, and all those who are convinced that the true history is much more complex and confusing than it is described in textbooks. This whisper is about ancient Rome. Could Caesar's subjects, the brilliant engineers who conquered Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, have crossed the boundless Atlantic? At first glance, it sounds like science fiction, like the plot of a Hollywood blockbuster. However, from time to time, artifacts emerge from the depths of American soil that cause even the most hardened skeptics to doubt. Ancient bronze coins with the profiles of Roman emperors, which farmers accidentally plow up in their fields in Kentucky or Ohio. Clay shards with ornaments strangely reminiscent of Mediterranean samples, and the most exciting rumors about stone ruins, whose masonry and construction principles allegedly have nothing to do with the traditions of Native Americans, but are suspiciously similar to what can be seen somewhere in the vicinity of Rome itself. These stories are passed down from generation to generation, published in small circulation magazines devoted to historical mysteries, and find new life in the digital space, becoming overgrown with incredible details. They paint a picture of an alternative past where Roman galleys, blown off course during a violent storm, or ships of desperate merchants seeking new markets, miraculously reach the American coast. They create images of battle-hardened legionnaires making their way through unfamiliar dense forests, and engineers vainly attempting to recreate a corner of their great empire in this strange and wild world. Of course, official science takes a firm and unambiguous position. There is no substantial and indisputable evidence of the presence of Romans in America before Columbus. Upon careful examination, each such find turns out to be either a modern forgery, the result of the activities of later collectors, or simply a misinterpretation. But what if there is a spark of real events hidden behind the veil of these myths? What if these inconvenient artifacts are not the product of fantasy or deception, but genuine, albeit rare, traces of a long-forgotten contact between two worlds? In this film, we will delve into the heart of this centuries-old mystery. We will not blindly believe or unconditionally deny. We will act as impartial investigators who, step by step, will examine all the evidence, listen to the arguments of both sides, and try to separate fact from fiction. And perhaps, at the end of this long journey, we will make a discovery that will prove to be much more striking than the myth of the Roman legions. We will rediscover the authentic, almost forgotten history of the ancient civilizations of the American continent itself. To separate truth from fiction, we need to arm ourselves with logic and take an unbiased look at the most compelling evidence of a Roman presence in America. Let's start with what excites the imagination the most: coins. Dozens of reports of finds of Roman denarii, sesterti, and aurae in various states, from Texas to Maine, seem to be a compelling argument. In 1967, a farmer in Kentucky found a coin from the time of Emperor Nero in the ground. Here, builders in Arizona discover a small cache of coins from the 2nd century AD. The stories are fascinating, but here, the prosaic context comes into play. The United States is a country of immigrants. Starting in the 18th century, and especially in the 19th century, millions of immigrants poured in from all over Europe. Many brought with them family heirlooms, souvenirs from their grand tours, and coins from their personal collections. It was easy to lose such an item in a field or on a construction site. Archaeologists note that none of these coins were found in a clean archaeological layer. That is, in the context of an ancient settlement that could be dated to the same time. They always turn out to be random finds, torn from their historical context. The next clue is the so-called Tucson artifacts. This is a collection of 31 lead objects, including crosses and sword-like items, discovered in 1924 near the city of Tucson, Arizona. The objects were covered with strange symbols and Latin inscriptions telling the story of a group of Roman Jews who fled Gaul and founded a colony here called Chalcis. The story caused quite a stir, but a thorough analysis by leading archaeologists and linguists of the time revealed a number of inconsistencies. The Latin was full of errors and anachronisms, and the style of engraving and craftsmanship indicated a modern origin. The conclusion of most scientists was unequivocal. It was a carefully thought-out hoax. But what about the Beth Creek inscription? A stone found in an Indian burial mound in Tennessee in 1889 contained mysterious symbols. For a long time, it was believed that this was an inscription in the Cherokee language. However, in the 1970s, the renowned Semitologist Cyrus Gordon claimed that if the stone was turned over, a phrase in Paleo-Hebrew could be read on it, meaning, "for Judah." This gave rise to a wave of theories about ancient Jewish sailors. But here, too, later research put everything in its place. Archaeologists working on excavations in the 19th century did not have modern knowledge. Most likely, the inscription was copied by them from a Masonic book or other source and misinterpreted. Moreover, radiocarbon analysis of charcoal found near the stone showed that the mound was created between the 3rd and 5th centuries AD, which does not fit with the time when Paleo-Hebrew was used. Studying this evidence, we see a common pattern: a sensational statement that attracts public attention, followed by painstaking scientific work that step by step destroys the myth. The absence of pottery, tools, building remains, roads, and, most importantly, genetic traces in the indigenous population all speak against the hypothesis of Roman colonization. The whispers about Rome turned out to be just an echo born of our own culture, a desire to find familiar features in an unknown world. But that doesn't mean that ancient America didn't have its own wonders. The real mysteries of this continent are far more grandiose. So, we have cast aside the alluring but unprovable myth of the Romans. Now we are ready to open the first page of the true, and therefore even more astonishing, history of ancient North America. Long before the first European ships touched its shores, amazing cultures flourished across vast expanses from the Great Lakes in the north to the Gulf Coast in the south, and from the Mississippi River in the west to the Atlantic Ocean in the east. As European colonists pushed deeper into the continent, they were amazed to stumble upon traces of their activities. Grand earthworks. These included conical mounds, truncated pyramids, giant embankments forming complex geometric shapes, and huge platforms. Not knowing who could have created all this, and refusing to believe that the ancestors of the wild Indians with whom they were fighting were capable of such things, the settlers gave these mysterious predecessors a common name: mound builders. This term, of course, is a gross simplification. It unites many different peoples and cultures that existed for almost 5,000 years, succeeding one another, trading, fighting, and influencing each other. It was not a single people or a single empire. It was an entire era, comparable in duration to the entire history of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome combined. The builders of the mounds were not a single civilization, but rather a succession of societies that shared a common tradition of building earthen mounds. Archaeologists conventionally divide their history into three main periods: Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippi. Each of them left behind unique monuments and mysteries. The earliest known mounds, such as Watson's Break in Louisiana, date back to about 3,500 BC. This makes them older than the famous Stonehenge and almost contemporaries of the first Egyptian pyramids. Imagine, while tombs for the pharaohs were being built on the banks of the Nile, hunter-gatherer societies in the forests of North America were already joining forces to create monumental structures that required incredible organization of labor. They did this without writing, without wheels, and without draft animals. Their tools were woven baskets, wooden shovels, and hoes made of stone and shells. With their own muscle power, they moved millions of cubic meters of earth, sand, and clay to build structures that have survived for millennia and continue to amaze us today. What motivated these people? Why did they expend so much energy building these earthen giants? The answers vary across cultures and eras. Some mounds were burial sites, tombs for chiefs, priests, or entire clans, filled with exquisite artifacts. Others served as platforms for temples or dwellings of the elite, elevating them above the everyday life of the common people. Still others, the most mysterious, had complex geometric or figurative shapes, and their purpose was probably related to astronomical observations, calendar cycles, or complex religious rituals. The story of the mound builders is not a story of aliens or lost races. It is a story of incredible ingenuity, social complexity, and deep spirituality of the indigenous peoples of America. In the following chapters, we will take a detailed look at the most prominent of these cultures and their creations, starting with the most ancient. Our journey to the origins of monumental construction in North America begins in northeastern Louisiana. in a place with the deceptively modest name of Poverty Point, or Cape of Poverty. The name was given to it in the 19th century by a local farmer, but it conceals one of the most remarkable and ancient archaeological sites on the planet. Recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Poverty Point is a huge complex of earthworks built between 1700 and 1000 BC. Think about that date. It's the time of the Trojan War, the era of Pharaoh Ramses II in Egypt, and at the same time, in the Mississippi River floodplain, a society that we consider to be a society of hunters and gatherers created a veritable prehistoric metropolis. What is Poverty Point? At the heart of the complex are 6 concentric earthen mounds forming a giant semicircle. If they had been completed, they would have formed a huge octagon. The outer mound is about 1 2/10 of a kilometer in diameter. These mounds are not very high. Today they are barely 1.5 meters high, but originally they were much higher. Archaeologists believe that dwellings stood on the crests of these mounds. According to the most conservative estimates, several hundred to several thousand people could have lived here at the same time, making Poverty Point one of the largest settlements of its time in the entire Western Hemisphere. Inside this giant amphitheater is a large flat area, or plaza, measuring about 15 hectares. It probably served as a place for gatherings, rituals, and social life. But the most impressive structures at Poverty Point are its mounds. The largest of these, known as Mound A, is sometimes called the Bird Mound because of its supposed shape when viewed from above. This colossal structure is over 22 meters high and about 210 meters long. In terms of volume, it is the second largest earthen mound in North America. Scientists have calculated that it took about 238,000 cubic meters of earth to create it. And most strikingly, recent research has shown that this gigantic structure was built in possibly as little as 90 days. This would have required the coordinated efforts of thousands of people working non-stop. Such a feat would be impossible without complex social organization and strong leadership. But who were these people, and why did they leave? They were not full-time farmers. Their diet consisted of fish, game, nuts, and wild plants. However, the very existence of such a huge permanent settlement speaks to the incredible abundance of natural resources in the Mississippi Delta at that time. Another mystery of Poverty Point is the artifacts. A huge number of items made from stone brought from far away have been found here. Flint from Ohio, sandstone from Arkansas, steatite from Alabama. The geography of the finds indicates the existence of an extensive trade network covering almost the entire southeastern United States. They created thousands of small clay balls of various shapes, which they heated in a fire and used for cooking in earthen ovens. Poverty Point existed for about 600 years and was then abandoned. The reasons for its decline remain a subject of debate. Perhaps climate change or shifts in the Mississippi River's course undermined the resource base that made life in such a large settlement possible. But one thing is clear. Poverty Point proves that a complex society with monumental architecture and long-distance trade links could have emerged in America long before the advent of agriculture and thousands of years before the Mayan and Aztec civilizations, leaving behind the archaic era and the mysteries of Poverty Point. We move through time and space. Our investigation takes us to the Ohio River Valley, around 800 BC. Here, in the wooded lands that are now the states of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia, A new cultural tradition known as the Adena culture is emerging. Its name comes from Thomas Worthington's estate near Chillicothe, Ohio, where a typical burial mound typical of this culture was excavated in 1901, becoming a benchmark. The Adena culture marks the beginning of the so-called woodland period, an important milestone in the history of ancient North America. It was at this time that key changes in people's lifestyles began to take place. The first pottery appeared, burial rituals became more complex, and, most importantly, the transition to a sedentary lifestyle based on primitive agriculture began. The Adena people were among the first to cultivate local plants, such as sunflowers, pumpkins, and quinoa. This was not yet full-fledged agriculture, but it allowed people to stay in one place longer, creating larger and more stable settlements. Two types of structures are characteristic of Adena culture. The first is conical burial mounds. Unlike the multi-layered and complex mounds of the Poverty Point culture, Adena mounds were usually created for one or more burials. The most important members of society, probably chiefs or shamans, were given elaborate burial rituals. They were buried in log tombs covered with bark and mats, and then a huge mound of earth was piled on top of them. Some of these mounds, such as the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, reach almost 20 meters in height. Rich gifts were placed in the graves along with the deceased. Exquisitely crafted stone smoking pipes in the shape of people or animals, copper and mica jewelry obtained from hundreds of kilometers away, and distinctive stone tablets with mysterious patterns. The second, and perhaps most mysterious type of Adena structure, is the so-called sacred circles. These are huge earthen mounds forming almost perfect circles with a diameter of up to several hundred meters. Inside the circle there was usually a moat, and in the center, a small burial mound. The purpose of these gigantic structures remains a subject of debate. Were they simply ritual enclosures for sacred burial sites? Or, as some researchers suggest, were they astronomical observatories whose passages and key points were oriented toward the positions of the sun and moon on the days of the solstices and equinoxes? The Aden people did not build cities as we understand them. They lived in small, scattered communities, but they were united by a common system of beliefs, rituals, and symbols, which found expression in these monumental earthen structures. Their culture lasted for almost 1,000 years, until about 100 CE, gradually transforming and giving way to an even more complex and vibrant culture known as Hopewell. The Adena culture laid the foundation. They were pioneers who turned simple hills into sacred monuments and began to decipher the language of the stars, inscribing it into the landscape of their land. Around 100 CE, a new powerful surge occurred in the cultural landscape of Eastern North America. The Adena culture was replaced by its successor, the Hopewell culture. This was not a conquest or displacement. Rather, it was an evolution, a development of the ideas laid down by their predecessors to a previously unseen level of complexity and scale. The name Hopewell also comes from the name of a farmer, Captain Mordecai Hopewell, on whose land in Ohio, at the end of the 19th century, large-scale excavations of a huge complex of burial mounds were carried out. The Hopewell era, which lasted until about 500 AD, became the golden age for the mound builders of the woodland period. If the Adena people were pioneers, then the representatives of the Hopewell culture became true masters. Their earthen structures are striking in their complexity and scale. They built not just individual mounds or circles, but entire ritual complexes covering tens and even hundreds of hectares. The most famous of these is the Hopewell Mound Complex in Newark, Ohio. It consists of giant embankments forming a huge circle, an octagon, and a square connected by wide avenues. The area of this complex is so large that in the 19th century, a country club with a golf course was built on its territory, which still exists there today, creating a surreal picture of ancient rituals and modern entertainment coexisting side by side. But what really sets Hopewell culture apart is not so much the size of their structures as the incredible scope of their exchange system, often referred to as the Hopewell sphere of interaction. It was not a trading empire in the Roman sense, with roads and legions. It was a complex network of ritual and social ties that united different peoples across a vast territory. In the Hopewell Mounds in Ohio, archaeologists are finding artifacts whose origins are astonishing. Huge blades made of obsidian, volcanic glass, brought from the area of the modern Yellowstone National Park, 2,500 kilometers away. Copper from the shores of Lake Superior, from which the most intricate jewelry, headdresses, and breastplates were made. Shells of giant mollusks from the Gulf of Mexico turned into ritual vessels. Silver from Canada. Shark and barracuda teeth from the Atlantic coast. And, of course, mica from the Appalachians, from which the finest figurines of people, animals, and mythical creatures were carved. These exotic materials were not essential items. They were prestigious goods, symbols of status and spiritual power. They were used in complex funeral rites, performed for the elite of society. The burials of the Hopewell leaders are veritable treasure troves. In one of the burial mounds, the remains of 2 people were found, covered with thousands of river pearls and hundreds of copper ornaments. In another, a cache was found with more than 200 exquisitely crafted smoking pipes, depicting all the animals known to the Hopewell people with incredible realism. This exchange system was probably based not on commercial gain, but on mutual gifts, pilgrimages to sacred centers, and shared religious beliefs. The Hopewell culture shows us a society that reached its peak without a centralized state, without cities, and without intensive agriculture. But around 500 CE, this complex system began to collapse. The construction of giant earthworks ceased, and exotic materials stopped coming to Ohio. The reasons for this collapse are another great mystery of American archaeology, which we will discuss later. Among the thousands of mounds scattered across eastern North America, there is one that stands out for its unique shape and inexplicable appeal. It is not impressive in height or volume, but its symbolism and mystery make it one of the most famous prehistoric monuments in the world. This is the Great Serpent Mound, located on a high plateau above Brush Creek in Adams County, Ohio. It is not a burial mound or a temple mound. It is a giant earth effigy, or shaped mound, depicting a writhing snake over 400 meters long. The snake's body bends 7 times, and its head appears to be swallowing or holding in its mouth a huge oval object, often interpreted as an egg, the sun, or a frog. The snake's tail ends in a tightly coiled spiral. Who, and more importantly, why built this grandiose image? This question has puzzled researchers for more than a century and a half. Initially, the creation of the mound was attributed to the Aden culture, as their burials were found nearby. However, more modern dating methods, including radiocarbon analysis of charcoal taken directly from the mound, indicate a later date, around 1700 AD. This was the heyday of the so-called Fort Ancient culture. heir to the traditions of the Mississippi culture in this region. But the debate over the date continues, and some scientists continue to insist on a more ancient, possibly Hopewell origin. But even more controversy surrounds the purpose of the mound. The most popular and convincing theory links it to astronomy. Researchers have found that the curves of the snake's body and its head correspond with great accuracy to important astronomical events. The snake's head points to the point of sunset on the day of the summer solstice. The curves of the body, in turn, may be associated with the points of moonrise and moonset at its extreme positions during its 18 6/10 year summer cycle. Thus, the mound could have been a giant calendar and observatory, allowing the prediction of the changing seasons and important lunar events. This was of enormous importance to agricultural societies whose life cycle was completely dependent on nature. Another theory suggests a purely symbolic, mythological meaning. The snake is a powerful symbol in many cultures around the world, including Native American cultures. It is associated with water, fertility, the underworld, and rebirth. Perhaps the mound depicts some kind of cosmogonic event, a myth about the creation of the world or the struggle between good and evil. The oval shape swallowed by the snake may symbolize life force or the sun, which the snake of the underworld tries to devour during an eclipse. There is also a third, more unusual hypothesis. In 150 AD, a bright flash of a supernova star that gave rise to the Crab Nebula could be observed near the mound. And in 166 AD, Halley's Comet flew over the Earth. Some researchers believe that the Great Serpent Mound may have been built as a memorial to one of these striking celestial events, forever imprinting it on the landscape. This place was not intended for living. Very few artifacts have been found here, which indicates its exclusively ritualistic nature. People came here at certain times to perform rituals related to celestial cycles, and then left again. The Great Serpent Mound remains a silent witness to the profound knowledge and complex spiritual life of the ancient peoples of America. It is not just an earthen mound, but a message encoded in the landscape that we are still trying to fully decipher. So far, we have talked about ritual centers, scattered settlements, and complex trade networks. But now, we come to the climax of our story. The history of a real ancient city, a metropolis that was the largest, most complex, and most influential settlement in pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico. Its name is Cahokia, located on the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River, not far from the modern city of St. Louis. Louis, Illinois. This city reached its peak between 1500 and 1200 AD. At its peak, Cahokia was larger than London at the same time. According to various estimates, its population ranged from 10 to 20,000 people, and if we take into account the small settlements and farms surrounding it, then as many as 40,000. It was a bustling hub of life, a center of power, religion, and culture, whose influence was felt hundreds of kilometers away. The heart of Cahokia is its monumental architecture. The city had about 120 mounds of various shapes and sizes. Unfortunately, many of them were destroyed in the 19th and 20th centuries as a result of land plowing and urban construction. But what has survived is breathtaking. The entire city is dominated by a colossal structure known as Monk's Mound. It got its name because Trappist monks lived on its summit in historical times. It is not just a mound, but a giant four-tiered pyramid with a truncated top. It is about 30 meters high, and has a base area of more than 5.5 hectares, which exceeds the base area of the Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt. At its summit once stood a huge building, probably a temple or a ruler's palace, from which there was a view of the entire city and its surroundings. The monastery mound was the center of the world for the inhabitants of Cahokia. At its foot stretched a huge central square, or Grand Plaza, measuring about 19 hectares. This perfectly leveled area was the site of major public ceremonies, ritual games similar to the Mesoamerican Pok-to-Pok, and possibly a market where goods from across the region converged. Surrounding the plaza were other large platform mounds on which stood the homes of the elite and other important public buildings. The entire central area of Cahokia, including the monastic mound and the Grand Plaza, was surrounded by a massive defensive palisade wall more than 3 kilometers long. The wall was made of 20,000 huge logs and had watchtowers located every 20 to 30 meters. This suggests that life in Cahokia was not always peaceful, and that the city had to defend itself from external enemies. Another amazing structure in Cahokia is the so-called wooden jigs. These are large circles formed by evenly spaced huge wooden posts. Archaeologists have restored one of them. It turned out to be a complex solar calendar. Observing from the central pole, priests could accurately determine the days of the equinoxes and solstices by noting the position of the rising sun relative to certain poles on the horizon. Cahokia was not just a cluster of people, but a carefully planned city with a clear social hierarchy. At the top was a powerful ruler, possibly deified, who lived on Monastery Mound. Below him were the priests and aristocracy, who lived on other mounds. And at the bottom, in simple huts, huddled artisans, farmers, and ordinary townspeople. It was the first truly urban society in the history of North America. What was life like in this ancient metropolis? Thanks to decades of painstaking archaeological research, we can reconstruct the daily life, beliefs, and social structure of Cahokia with a degree of certainty. The basis of its prosperity was agriculture, in particular the cultivation of maize, or corn. It was the emergence of high-yield varieties of maize around 900 AD that made it possible to feed a huge population concentrated in one place and free up labor for the construction of monumental structures. In addition to maize, the inhabitants of Cahokia grew pumpkins, beans, and other crops, and were also actively engaged in hunting and fishing in the fertile Mississippi floodplain. Society was strictly hierarchical. Archaeological finds from burials clearly indicate deep social stratification. While most people were buried in simple graves without any objects, the burials of the elite are striking in their wealth and, at times, cruelty. The most famous of these is Mound 72. This is a small, unremarkable mound that turned out to be the tomb of one of the rulers of Cahokia, who died around 150 AD. He was buried on a bed of 20,000 beads made from seashells brought from the Gulf of Mexico. Hundreds of rare arrowheads made of flint from all over North America, copper plates, and rolls of mica were placed next to him. But the most shocking thing about this burial is the evidence of mass human sacrifice. More than 250 people were buried with the ruler. In one of the pits, the remains of 53 young women between the ages of 15 and 25 were found, apparently ritually killed. In another, the bodies of 4 men with severed heads and hands were found. These findings paint a picture of a powerful and ruthless authority for which human life had varying value. Religion permeated all aspects of life in Cahokia. Their beliefs were part of the so-called Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a complex system of mythology and iconography that spread throughout the southeastern United States. Key themes were dualism, the opposition of the upper and lower worlds, ancestor worship, and the deification of rulers. But, like all great civilizations, Cahokia fell into decline. And this decline was rapid and mysterious. By about 1350, the once bustling metropolis was completely abandoned. Huge areas were depopulated, mounds were overgrown with grass, and the palisade rotted away. Why? There is no single answer, but there are several leading hypotheses. The first is ecological. Intensive agriculture and deforestation for construction and heating could have led to soil erosion, flooding, and resource depletion. The second is social and political. Perhaps a rigid hierarchical system led to internal conflicts, uprisings, or civil war. Evidence of fortified fences and traces of fires may indicate this. The third hypothesis is climatic. Climate change, such as prolonged droughts, could have undermined the basis of their agriculture and led to famine. Most likely, the decline of Cahokia was caused by a combination of all these factors. When the first French arrived in the region in the 17th century, they found only overgrown hills. The memory of the great city had been almost completely erased. The mystery of its sudden disappearance remains one of the most intriguing questions in North American history. The fall of Cahokia did not mean the end of civilization in North America. On the contrary, it became a catalyst for the spread of its cultural influence across a vast territory. Like seeds scattered by the wind from a withering flower, the ideas, technologies, and beliefs born in the Mississippi Valley gave rise to a multitude of new societies. Archaeologists refer to the period from approximately 1200 to 1600 CE as the late Mississippian period. During this time, dozens of new cities and chiefdoms sprang up across the southeastern United States, from Oklahoma to Florida, many of which imitated Cahokia, but also developed their own unique features. We see the same pattern: cities built around a central plaza with a large pyramidal mound for a temple or chief's residence. We see the same dependence on corn agriculture and the same complex social hierarchy. This vast cultural community became known as the Mississippi culture. Among the most famous and impressive centers of this era are Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, and Spiro in Oklahoma. Moundville, located on the banks of the Black Warrior River, was the second largest city of the Mississippian culture after Cahokia. It had about 29 platform mounds surrounding a large rectangular plaza. Moundville was not only a political center, but also an important religious and burial center. Its iconography, reflected in exquisite ceramics and engraved stone palettes, is full of complex symbols associated with the afterlife. Images of winged serpents, hands with eyes on their palms, and warriors with falcon attributes are all elements of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, which reached its peak here. The city of Etowah in Georgia was known for its monumental burial mounds and, most strikingly, two marble statues depicting a man and a woman. These sculptures, found in one of the burial mounds, are unique to North America of that period and testify to the highest level of skill of local stone carvers. But perhaps the most mysterious and prosperous center was Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma. Speyer was the gateway to the Great Plains and a major trading center. Its burial mounds, especially one called the Great Morgue, yielded a quantity of exotic and ritual objects unmatched anywhere else in North America. Thousands of pearls, hundreds of engraved shells from the Gulf of Mexico, fabrics painted with intricate patterns, copper plates, and mysterious wooden masks. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, the Spiral Mounds were barbarically looted by treasure hunters, who blew up the central burial vault with dynamite in search of treasures. Much of this unique heritage was irretrievably lost or sold to private collections. Nevertheless, what archaeologists managed to salvage speaks to Spiro as an incredibly rich and influential center, a kind of American Thebes. All of these cultures continued to flourish and develop until the arrival of Europeans. It was their descendants, the Natchez, Creek, Choctaw, and many others, who were encountered by the first Spanish and French expeditions. These societies were the last echo of the great tradition of the mound builders, a tradition that would be tragically interrupted by disease, war, and colonization. One of the most fundamental questions that arises when looking at the giant mounds of Cahokia or the geometrically precise embankments of Hopewell is, how? How did ancient societies, who did not know iron, did not use draft animals such as horses or oxen, and had not invented the wheel for transportation, manage to carry out these grandiose construction projects? The answer lies in three key factors: ingenious use of available materials, a deep understanding of their environment, and, most importantly, an incredible capacity for social organization. Let's take a look at the tools. The arsenal of the mound builders was simple but effective. To loosen the soil, they used hoes made of stone, large mollusk shells, or bison shoulder blades attached to wooden handles. Woven baskets made of reeds or bark were used to carry the soil, which people carried on their backs or shoulders. It is estimated that one basket could hold about 18 to 20 kilograms of soil. Now, imagine the volume of the monastic mound in Cahokia, more than 600,000 cubic meters. That's millions and millions of baskets of soil carried by hand. It was a titanic task, estimated to have taken several centuries and required the efforts of many generations. But it wasn't just brute force. The builders of the mounds were skilled engineers. They had a thorough understanding of the properties of different types of soil. During excavations, archaeologists discovered that the mounds were not just shapeless piles of earth. They have a complex internal structure. The builders used different layers of clay, sand, and loam to ensure drainage and stability. They alternated wet and dry materials, carefully compacting them to create a solid, monolithic core that would not be washed away by rain or settle under its own weight. It was a complex, sophisticated technology passed down from generation to generation. Planning large-scale projects such as the Newark Complex or the city of Cahokia required considerable knowledge of geometry and astronomy. Creating perfect circles, squares, and octagons across hundreds of meters of rugged terrain would have been impossible without ropes, pegs, and basic principles of geometry. The astronomical orientation of structures, as in the case of Woodhenge or Serpent Mound, indicates long-term and systematic observations of the movement of celestial bodies. Priest astronomers had to possess knowledge that allowed them not only to record these events, but also to incorporate them into architectural plans. But the most important tool was social organization. None of these projects could have been implemented without a strong central authority capable of mobilizing and coordinating the labor of thousands of people. The chief or priestly elite had to have sufficient authority to convince or compel the population to participate in these labor-intensive works, which did not bring any immediate practical benefit. Probably, The construction of burial mounds was part of a religious duty, a social obligation. It was a way to please the gods, honor the ancestors, and strengthen social unity. The construction projects themselves, requiring joint efforts, became a powerful factor uniting society. Thus, the builders of the burial mounds compensated for their technological simplicity with the highest level of organization, deep knowledge in the field of applied sciences, and powerful ideological motivation. They are a striking example of how the greatness of a civilization is determined not by the availability of certain technologies, but by the ability to use available resources as effectively as possible to achieve grandiose goals. Now that we have seen the greatness and complexity of the authentic ancient civilizations of America, let's return to the question we started with. If such remarkable cultures existed on the continent, why did the myth of the lost race of mound builders arise and become so popular in the 19th century? Why did European settlers so stubbornly refuse to believe that these structures were created by the ancestors of the Native Americans they saw around them? The answer to this question lies not in archaeology, but in psychology, politics, and ideology. When American pioneers and scientists began to systematically study the mounds, they encountered a conflict of worldviews. On the one hand, there were these grandiose earthen structures, evidence of a developed, settled, and organized society. On the other hand, there was the dominant image of the Indian at that time, a noble but savage, incapable of complex labor, monumental architecture, and long-term planning. This stereotype was very convenient for justifying the policy of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to expand westward and occupy the entire continent. To acknowledge that Native Americans had highly developed civilizations in the past would have meant acknowledging their right to this land. It was much easier to declare that the real, civilized builders of the mounds had long since disappeared, and that the modern Indians were just wild nomads who had come to these lands later and had no connection to the great past. Thus was born the myth of the lost race. Whoever could be thought of was put forward for this role. Vikings, Phoenicians, Egyptians, lost tribes of Israel, and even inhabitants of the mythical Atlantis. This myth solved several problems at once. First, it explained the existence of the mounds without destroying the convenient stereotype about the Indians. Second, it created a heroic and ancient past for the young American nation, linking it, albeit mythically, to the great civilizations of the Old World. Americans became not just colonists on foreign soil, but heirs to a certain ancient white race, reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. This myth was actively supported by popular literature, newspaper articles, and even some scholars of the time. President Andrew Jackson, author of the infamous Indian Removal Act, which led to the forced expulsion of thousands of people along the Trail of Tears, directly referred in his speeches to the fact that Native Americans had no rights to the land because they did not build the burial mounds. The myth became a powerful ideological weapon. However, by the end of the 19th century, serious science began to deal devastating blows to this myth. Cyrus Thomas, an employee of the Smithsonian Institution, played a key role in this. On his initiative, a large-scale program was carried out to study burial mounds throughout the country. After many years of excavation and analysis, in 1894, Thomas published his monumental report, in which he presented irrefutable evidence that the builders of the burial mounds were the ancestors of modern Native Americans. He showed a direct continuity in the types of artifacts, burial rites, and artistic styles between the finds in the burial mounds and the culture of the Indian tribes encountered by Europeans. Science won, but the myth proved surprisingly resilient. Psychologically, it was difficult for people to abandon an idea that fit so well into their worldview and justified their actions. The story of the myth of the mound builders is an instructive example of how racial prejudice and political expediency can distort perceptions of the past, and how science can ultimately restore historical justice. It would seem that after Cyrus Thomas's damning report and decades of subsequent archaeological research, the myth of outsider builders in ancient America should have died out for good. But, as we know, some ideas are like viruses. They can lie dormant for a while, but under favorable conditions, they mutate and cause a new epidemic. In the 20th and 21st centuries, old myths have found new life thanks to modern media, popular books, television shows, and, of course, the internet. If in the 19th century the Vikings or Phoenicians played the role of the lost race, today their place has been taken by even more exotic candidates: Atlanteans, Lemurians, and even aliens. Pseudo-documentary series such as Ancient Aliens, with an audience of millions around the world, actively promote the idea that the monumental structures of the past, whether Egyptian pyramids or American burial mounds, were built with the help of extraterrestrial technology. Any inconvenient knowledge of the ancients, for example, in the field of astronomy or engineering, is declared not to be the result of human genius, but a gift from gods from other planets. Why are these ideas so popular? First, they offer simple answers to complex questions. It is much easier to believe that the Serpent Mound is a landing site for UFOs than to understand the intricacies of lunar cycles and archaeoastronomy. Second, they exploit our innate sense of wonder and thirst for mystery. The idea of paleocontact seems more exciting and romantic than the prosaic story of thousands of people carrying Earth in baskets. Third, and most alarmingly, modern myths, like their 19th century predecessors, continue, albeit unconsciously, to belittle the achievements of indigenous civilizations. By claiming that Native Americans could not have built Cahokia without outside help, proponents of pseudo-archaeology are essentially repeating the old racist thesis. They were incapable of doing it. This is a hidden form of intellectual colonialism that robs indigenous peoples of their own history and heritage. One striking example of modern mystification is the story of the Giants of Ohio. Hundreds of articles and videos circulate on the internet claiming that in the 19th century, the Smithsonian Institution allegedly discovered skeletons of people, ranging from 2.5 to 3.5 meters tall in the Aden and Hopewell Mounds, and then concealed these findings so as not to rewrite history. As evidence, quotes from old newspapers taken out of context and obviously fake photographs are cited. In fact, there is no scientific evidence for the existence of a race of giants. The people of the Adena culture were indeed slightly taller than their neighbors on average, but their height did not exceed 180 centimeters. Stories about giants are a classic example of a media virus that feeds on distrust of official science and conspiracy theories. The fight against pseudoscience and hoaxes is more important today than ever. It requires us not only to trust the scientific method, but also to develop critical thinking. Before accepting a sensational theory, it is worth asking yourself a few questions. Who is promoting it? What is their evidence? Is there an alternative, simpler, and more logical explanation? A responsible attitude toward the past means not only respect for the facts, but also respect for the people who created that past. How does modern science distinguish fact from fiction? How do archaeologists get silent stones and layers of earth to tell the true story of the past? Today, they have technologies at their disposal that would have seemed like magic even to scientists of the last century. One of the most revolutionary methods is radiocarbon analysis, or carbon-14 dating. This method allows us to determine with high accuracy the age of organic materials, wood, coal, bones, tissues, up to 50,000 years old. It works like this. All living organisms absorb carbon from the atmosphere during their lifetime, including its unstable isotope, carbon-14. After the organism dies, absorption stops, and carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring how much of this isotope remains in a sample, scientists can calculate how much time has passed since the organism died. It was radiocarbon analysis that made it possible to establish the true age of PowerPoint, debunk the myth of the antiquity of the Beth Creek inscription, and determine the chronology of the Adena, Hopewell, and Cahokia. Another breakthrough technology is LiDAR, or airborne laser scanning. LiDAR is like an X-ray for the landscape. An airplane or drone flying over a dense forest sends millions of laser pulses to the ground. A computer analyzes the reflected signals and can remove all vegetation, trees, shrubs, grass from the image, leaving only the bare relief of the Earth's surface. This method has revolutionized tropical forest archaeology, allowing entire Mayan cities to be discovered. But it has also proved invaluable in North America. With the help of LiDAR, scientists are finding new, previously unknown mounds and earthworks hidden under the tree canopy and refining maps of already known complexes, revealing details that are invisible from the ground. Geophysical methods, such as ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, allow us to look underground without digging it up. An archaeologist walking slowly across a field with a device resembling a lawnmower can obtain a map of what lies beneath on their computer screen. The foundations of ancient walls, hearths, pits, ditches, and even individual burials. This allows for precise planning of excavations, saving time and resources, and preserving those parts of the monument that do not require immediate study. Studying isotopes in the bones and teeth of ancient people can tell us about their diet and migrations. By analyzing the ratio of strontium isotopes, which depends on the geology of the area, scientists can determine whether a person grew up where they were buried or came from afar. This is how it was proven that many of the Cahokia elite, including the people buried in Mound 72, were first-generation immigrants. And, of course, DNA analysis. Paleogenetics allows ancient DNA to be extracted and studied from skeletal remains. It is a powerful tool for establishing kinship between ancient populations and tracking their migrations. DNA research has unequivocally confirmed what Cyrus Thomas proved archaeologically. The genetic ancestors of the mound builders and the population of pre-Columbian America as a whole are peoples who came from Siberia via Beringia thousands of years ago. No traces of Roman, Egyptian, or any other non-American DNA have been found in pre-Columbian remains. Science does not stand still. Every year, new methods emerge that allow us to obtain even more information from tiny fragments of the past. A scientific approach based on verifiable data and critical analysis is the most reliable way to understand our true history. A path that may not be as sensational as pseudoscience, but one that leads us to the truth. Our long investigation is coming to an end. We began with an intriguing myth about the Romans and ended with the real, but no less exciting story of the great civilizations of the mound builders. But what has become of this heritage today? Is the memory of Cahokia and Hopewell alive? For a long time, these great monuments were forgotten or threatened with destruction. Many mounds were plowed by farmers, torn down for the construction of roads and cities, and looted by treasure hunters. Their very existence was ignored or attributed to mythical races. However, in the second half of the 20th century, the situation began to change. Thanks to the efforts of archaeologists, historians, and, most importantly, Native Americans themselves, a process of reclaiming and reinterpreting this heritage began. Today, many of the largest complexes such as Cahokia, Power Point, Hopewell, and Snake Mound have been designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites, or National Historic Landmarks. They are protected by the state, and museums and interpretation centers have been established on their grounds to tell millions of visitors the true history of these places. But the most important change has been in the attitude toward Native Americans themselves. They are no longer passive subjects of study, but have become active participants in the preservation and interpretation of their past. Modern Indian tribes, such as the Osage, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and many others, consider themselves direct descendants of the mound builders. For them, these mounds are not just archaeological monuments, but sacred places, the homes of their ancestors, centers of their spiritual power. Today, archaeologists work closely with tribal representatives. Before excavations begin, consultations are held with elders. Native American communities participate in the management of historical parks, conduct their traditional ceremonies on the territory of ancient settlements, reviving long-lost rituals. This process does not always go smoothly. Disputes over repatriation, that is, the return to tribes of the remains of their ancestors and sacred objects stored in museums, continue to this day. It is a complex dialogue between scientific interests and religious beliefs, between the right of science to knowledge and the right of a people to respect for their dead. The story of the mound builders is not just a chapter in an ancient history textbook. It is a living, breathing part of the modern world. It reminds us of the incredible resilience and creativity of the human spirit. It teaches us that civilization can take many different forms, and that the absence of the wheel or writing is not a sign of backwardness. It makes us think about the fragility of our own achievements and the mark we will leave behind. Most importantly, it restores historical justice by giving the indigenous peoples of America their rightful place in the pantheon of great human cultures. This is not a lost heritage. It was forgotten, distorted, but not lost. And today, thanks to the joint efforts of scientists and the descendants of the ancient builders, it is being revived to tell us its amazing story.